Welcome to Coffee and Divination, a podcast about the arts of obtaining hidden knowledge in changing times. Join me, Joanna Farrar, to chat with experts from around the world on tarot, runes, geomancy, and the many ways divination can help us navigate and plan our paths ahead. A quick note. Today's episode is a discussion of Renaissance magic, philosophy, Hellenistic traditions, and so much more, all surrounding the Sola-Busca Tarocchi, created and illustrated in the 15th century. This deck is a beautiful work of art and extremely unique in many ways, and if you can, I recommend checking out the episode over on our Vimeo channel, as I've put in a few slides showing some of the cards as we discuss them to give you a taste of the artistic world these cards come from. We discuss so much more than just the few cards I included slides of, though, so hearing it will work just as well and be fascinating, I'm sure. There was only one spot where our internet caused a tiny break in what was said, but it was luckily very quick. I hope you enjoy this episode, as I certainly did, and please click the subscribe button and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts when you can, as it really helps. Enjoy the show. Thank you all for listening and for joining us today on Coffee and Divination. I am honored to be introducing our guest today, Peter Mark Adams, who is an author, a scholar, a poet, who specializes in the ethnography of ritual, sacred landscapes, esotericism, and healing. His works have been published by Inner Traditions and Scarlet Imprint and include The Game of Saturn, Decoding the Sola-Busca Tarocchi, and Mystai, Dancing Out the Mysteries of Dionysus. The Game of Saturn, which we will be discussing here today, is a work which leads the reader through a fascinating journey, exploring the 15th century Sola-Busca, which is a work of stunning beauty and complexity, as well as containing tantalizing clues regarding Renaissance practices of ritual magic. I loved the book when it first came out a few years ago, so I am so excited to talk about it here today. So thank you for being here.
Oh, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So to get us started, there's so much that you've written about mystery traditions and magic, and of course the Sola-Busca that we're here to discuss today is in itself such an interesting investigation into ritual magic practices of the past. So I wanted to ask you, before we dive into that itself, what kind of was your background? How did you get pulled into this? What was the fascination with these subjects in general that led you on this path?
I think it probably goes back so far in time, I'm hardly aware of it, to be honest, Joanna. I think we all live on two tracks, which one is the rational narrative we spin about who we are and how we come to be where we are in life. But the other one is far more intangible and is perhaps more profound. It's a kind of tangential narrative, not all of which we can see, most of which is occluded from ourselves, but nevertheless brings about some of the most significant changes in life. So your question really, I could spin a narrative about that, but the truth is there's an element in this process which is profoundly occulted. So that, when you ask, for instance, where are the roots of my interest in the Sola-Busca specifically, I would have to say, oh, well, was purchased by the Italian state in 2009. They had an exhibition and catalogue. I saw it in 2012. And of course, I couldn't explain any of the imagery, despite the fact that I've been interested in tarot since I was in my teens. So, that's the kind of rational explanation. It's that perplexity in the face of the grotesqueries, the opaqueness of the imagery, and yet the very high standards of its execution. It was almost disproportionate to say that how much time and energy is spent on creating this artifact, and so little is given in terms of an explanation for it, then or now. And the gap between these two positions is so wide, it absolutely draws you in and you fall down the chasm, so to speak. And you never find your way out again, to be honest. It's a real labyrinth.
much deeper than a rabbit hole. So,
Oh yeah, yeah, it does.
well, then before
So
we kind of dive into that, you mentioned being fascinated with tarot. Can you speak just a little bit about, like, so you did have a background in tarot, which went, as you mentioned, kind of then drew you into this deck, which has so little in common with what we think of today
yeah,
as tarot.
absolutely.
Would you say that you practice tarot a lot, that you were a scholar of other tarot decks, or was it something other?
Okay, I've always been on the esoteric side of things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not into history per se.
Mm-hmm.
I have to deal with the history to expand and examine esoteric concepts, but I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic in any sense. Okay, so for me, it all kind of comes just from the heart. I follow my nose into these things and then just see where I show up. I have no knowledge picking up a project like this, or indeed Mystai, of where it's going to lead me. Okay, so for the tarot, I've been strongly attracted to many esoteric and occult areas of interest from my early teens. I could even go back further to when I was 8 or 9 years old, and some of those strange experiences we have as children. And one of them was an encounter with the treasures of Tutankhamun, for instance. I was looking at them in a weekend supplement of a newspaper, and I was totally entranced with these treasures. And strangely enough, 9 months later, I was standing in front of them in Cairo, and that kind of experience thrusts you further along, So, yeah, I was fascinated by the tarot. And I think in the probably late 60s, early 70s, we started seeing these tarot decks coming on the market. They started to become more accessible. And that included the standard Smith-Waite deck, as well as the Crawley Thoth deck. Okay, so this was kind of a seminal period for the printing and production of these. And it kind of started the trend towards what we call mind, body, spirit books as well. We saw a lot of them coming out about them. So I was fascinated with the tarot and the background to it. And most of the background was conventional late 19th century occultism of the Golden Dawn variety. I mean, that was kind of mainstream. Mm-hmm. So absorbing that as an interpretive scheme pretty well fixes the imagery in your mind, and all the variations that occur in different decks are just playing upon a constant theme, essentially. So when you run across the Sola-Busca, you kind of confidently open these cards up and you start looking for these familiar patterns within it. And lo and behold, they're not there. But the artwork is stunning, and there's clearly some system at work. There's some kind of organizing structure, and there has to be a rationale for the time, effort, and artistry involved in creating it. Yes. So that's really where I got on the starting blocks for this particular project. It took me about 3 years working day and night to enter the imagery. And it came about through little tiny steps. I'd had a great interest in Mithraism, for instance, and when I saw 2 cards, one with a torch held up and one with a torch held down, that kind of jolted me into thinking about the torch bearers within the Mithraic mysteries, the Cortes and Cortopates they're called, which mark the solstices. And so with the concept of the solstices, that set me off searching now as to why they should be so significant. And that proved to be the key into the deck, essentially, into the deck's symbolism. And I hasten to add, a huge percentage of it is still undecoded, especially in the suit cards. We're not there yet, by a long shot.
Yes, I would love to touch on that a little bit later. But So I think it's important for people who may not have seen your fantastic book and may not have had the chance to see these cards to kind of place this a little bit for people. We've already kind of said that, you know, it is not similar to your garden variety decks that anyone would be familiar with today. It's completely different from that in all ways, and it is also incredibly beautifully illustrated in a way that was very uncommon, and every card is beautifully illustrated. It's not like gaming decks from hundreds of years after. Can you just kind of situate for people, if they haven't seen it, what it kind of looks like and what that feel of the cards is, just as an overview, and then we can dive more into it? If you hadn't seen it, what would you want to know about it?
Okay, well, I don't know if people know the so-called Mantegna Tarocchi. This is a 52 card deck created in Ferrara as well. But it's not a Tarocchi, and it certainly is not by Mantegna. But it's kind of emblematic world of the Renaissance, the planets, the virtues, the way the Renaissance thought symbolically is depicted in that 52 card deck. So there was a tradition in Ferrara of placing imagery into strange situations. I mean, I can't think why you would choose a card deck necessarily to illustrate that. And the same argument can be made about the Sola-Busca. It isn't an obvious place to encode a completely strange metaphysical and, I would argue, ritual subtext beneath a historical looking artifact, because most of the figures in the trumps appear to be taken from one or two chapters of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Greeks and Romans. So you'll see, if you know that text at all, you'll know that he compares a Greek hero with a Roman figure. And many of the common Roman patrician families are represented in that text, of course. So from within those narratives, whoever designed the Sola-Busca appears to have picked out certain names. Now, it's only when you understand the logic of his choice that you begin to get an insight into just how clever this was. And we can take one example, which is not too visual, and explain the logic of this, Joanna. We take a card called Lentulus, and it depicts a very richly dressed figure placing a candle on an altar. And he's kind of gripping his beard. And he wears what is basically a pileus, a shepherd's cap on his head. And the card is, as I say, called Lentulus. Now, this took me a long time to decode. Lentulus is a figure in Plutarch's Parallel Lives. He's in the life of Cicero. And the Lentulus, the Cornelii Lentulus, were one of the Roman patrician families. And on Saturnalia, one of them attempted a coup d'etat in Rome. Okay, so I was able to, the rich dress, the shepherd's cap, the placing a candle on an altar are all symbolic of Saturnalia. And the reference in the Renaissance to that would have been one of Martial's epigrams, 14:1, actually. The strange thing about the imagery is that when you've explained that, and knowing that Lentulus led this coup d'etat, it turns out that he was executed for it by strangulation. And strangulation, strangely enough, seems to be a sub-theme within the deck, but let's not go into that.
Oh, I'm sure we're going to get there. So here we are.
People should be advised, this is very Saturnian.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Okay. This is the Renaissance eyes wide shut.
Yes.
Okay,
well,
so...
Yeah, oh no. Please.
Let me just finish with this figure, but there's a couple of items of imagery in the card which have nothing whatsoever to do with this tale of Lentulus or Saturnalia. The gripping the beard with one hand is a very old symbolic part of the iconography of Europe. For you see it in medieval marginalia, for instance, or in the grotesqueries in the stonework of medieval churches. And it seems to relate to a kind of burlesque humor that they expressed in these contexts. Specifically, an act of masturbation is indicated. It's very strange. The other one is that he has this like red fillet or purple fillet tied around the shepherd's cap. And again, this is not attested for Saturnalia, but it is certainly the mark of a Roman priest. Okay. The third element is this large kind of serpent form, which is knotted around his waist. And here we just launch off into a completely different symbolic language in 3 different directions. And all of a sudden, you like fall through the historical floor, through this trapdoor into Roman priestly practices, Orphic mysticism, and a very strange space indeed to find in a Renaissance tarocchi. Okay.
I think that also, that kind of, it's important in looking at this this deck, and you spend a great deal of time carefully going through the worldview of who might have been the receivers or the creators of this deck, which is definitely not cleanly Christian in any sense of the word, in that sense that, as you were saying, astrology and so much of these stories of mythology and things like that were evidenced and also a part of probably contemporary magical practices that were happening at the time. So there's a lot of symbology that's included in the deck that we may not recognize as easily today as those, people at the time did, which included, practices of necromancy, folk occult practices, even shamanistic cults you point out, like the Benedante and stuff like that. So there was a lot going on in that world. And so can you maybe paint a little bit of a picture for people of what the historical placement of this deck is? Because I think that before we go deeper in it, it might help to have a little bit of a foothold of who this was produced by, who it was for, and kind of what that worldview was that they were living in.
Yeah, I mean, this Renaissance period was a very disturbed one in Italy. We're looking at small city-states like Ferrara, or Florence, essentially a banking oligarchy, or Venice with the patrician oligarchs. And almost all these tiny states are not only intermarried with each other, they're all in violent conflict with one another and with the external powers. This is an incredibly disturbed period of history. So against that background, Renaissance sorcery was a major investment for all levels and sectors of society, from folk magic at the roots all the way up to full-on, what would you call it? I suppose you would call it the Goetia. So essentially, because of today we so much take it for granted that there's federal and regional or national police forces and armies and things. We don't have to concern ourselves with that. Here, in this period, every single town and city had to take care of its own security. And in that age, magical or offensive magical and defensive magical practices were an integral part of day-to-day security. Astrology was the guide to what was down the road. And you needed to judge your daily, weekly actions on propitious days. Elective astrology was incredibly important to try and see what was coming at you. They all employed, I'm talking about the patrician class, they all employed significant sorcerers to work for them. The nature of the sorcery was demonic. It was wholly demonic sorcery. Okay, but whereas today we would find that perhaps ethically difficult to justify in that age of total insecurity, you might say. And this was a society as well that had just emerged partially out of the Great Plague of the previous century. So that the devastation, perhaps a third of the population in some towns and cities, 50, 60% of the population had been decimated. And the plague continued to recur every 5 to 7 years for the next 300-400 years. It was a fact of life, you know. So our own pandemic is by no means historically abnormal, not by a long stretch. So in that context, ritual magic, and specifically demonic magic, was the order of the day. Okay, now what I want to say is that the magical system that seems to be embedded in the Sola-Busca has nothing whatsoever to do with the indigenous magical practices of Renaissance Italy. And that's very strange. It's really coming out of left field. What we appear to have is a Hellenistic ritual system, metaphysics, and cosmology. And the big question is, how was this transferred from the Byzantine Empire to this small city-state of Ferrara in the middle of Italy?
Well, yes. I think that, well, there's a couple of different ways we could go from there. There was a very important figure that you talk about in the book, Plethon, who came, I think, what was it, 50 or so years earlier or more?
Yeah, 1438, 1439, yeah.
So, and just to clarify, we are talking about, like, for the dates of the deck, we're talking about late 15th century. So all of this is the place that we're talking about in the 15th century.
Half a century before, yeah.
Yeah, so Plethon was before that, and he is, if we are talking about going back, so much of what is encoded that you elucidate in the book is encoded and comes from, even if it's Hellenistic, like very specifically Carthaginian and North African influences. But some of this was coming through from people like Plethon, who were entering Italy, and some of the texts that were being translated around that time in the 15th century. Can you maybe talk to us about who he was, who Plethon was, and why he is so significant for this period?
I think one of the things we have difficulty grasping today is the persistence of the Hellenistic and pagan tradition within Eastern Mediterranean world. You know, as late as the 9th century, the archbishops of Constantinople were trying to stop the people from celebrating the rites of Dionysus. You know, it's like all the old festivals were still going on, but in an increasingly carnivalesque manner. Whereas, you know, they'd lost some of their ritual purity, and but they were still practiced. People were still sacrificing animals. You know, the Cronia, the big festival of Kronos, called Brumalia, from the 24th of November through to the 17th of December, was celebrated throughout the Hellenistic world. And then you came to the winter solstice, you know, and that was the great festival of Kronos, Saturnalia in the Roman vocabulary. So, you know, because we have this kind of image of icons and the Byzantines and Christianity, Orthodoxy and everything as a dominant thread in our education, in our history, in our visual education through documentaries, it kind of bypasses or somehow elides what was actually happening. Okay. I mean, certainly until the mid-6th century, Hellenistic philosophers were still teaching in Alexandria. They were teaching Plato in a very pure form, along with theurgy. And they were teaching doctrines that absolutely contradicted the core of Christianity. The eternal life of the soul, reincarnation, the universe has always been here, it wasn't created ex nihilo. All of this was so, and the problem for the church, of course, was that Plato and the other literary forms, the mythological tradition, was embedded in the literature. It's, you know, it's there in the Iliad and the Odyssey and all the literature, all the drama, the poetry and the philosophy. You cannot eradicate it. The culture, it's kind of baked in. This polytheistic, metaphysical, enlightened culture is kind of baked in. So despite the church's best efforts for 1,000-odd years, we have periodic kind of outbreaks, if that's the right word, of pagan and Hellenistic interest and practice. So I say mid-6th century, it was still going fairly strong. And Olympiodorus the Younger was teaching in Alexandria. And I mention him specifically because his notes, his lecture notes on Plato turned up 500 years later in Constantinople. And of course, around that time, 9th and 10th centuries, we see Michael Purcellus at the center of a Hellenistic revival. And again, the notes disappeared and they turn up again 500 years on. And this time they're in the context of a man called George Gemistos, otherwise known as Platon. He was the leading scholar of Platonic studies of the age, a convinced Hellenist and a practitioner of theurgy. He even wrote a full pagan Bible in which he put all the rituals, hymns to sing, evocation of the deities. And he was teaching this system down in southern Greece in a small hilltop town called Mystra. He was teaching it under the aegis of the emperor's son, because at the very peak of Byzantine society, there was this persistent, educated thread of Hellenistic metaphysics and belief. It never entirely went away, but it was suppressed in some periods and kind of burst out into the open in other periods. So that's the background to who Platon was. He was an imperial advisor, the leading Platonic scholar of the age, and he was part of the emperor's delegation when the Byzantine emperor traveled to Italy to try and effect a reconciliation with the Roman Church. The reason they did that, of course, is that by the 15th century, a large part of the Byzantine Empire had been eaten up by the Ottomans and Seljuks. So most of Anatolia was under Muslim control by then, as was, of course, North Africa and the Greek islands. So this tiny lump state of Byzantium was looking for protection by attempting to get closer to the Italian elites. That's the Venetian elite who could afford to sponsor an army, for instance. But the age of crusades was over. The Battle of Nicopolis a century before had been such a disastrous defeat that the West never attempted a crusade after that. And although they effected a reconciliation of the Orthodox and Roman churches, it was essentially too late to have any effect. Because in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans. Platon saw this coming, as did many Byzantine intellectuals. And it's because of this that we see a flood of high-quality manuscripts and training in Greek language interchange between the Italian city-states and Constantinople. So there was, in effect, a bridge being created between them, and a bridge specifically in the case of Ferrara and Constantinople. There's one of the leading Italian scholars of Greek, Guarino da Verona, lived in Constantinople, studied Greek with the elite Hellenists, and returned to become the personal tutor to one of the Este family of Ferrara. He was also the chair of Greek culture and literature at Ferrara University. And of course, when the Byzantine delegation arrived in Ferrara, he was the translator. So he would have met and known Platon personally. Platon saw this opportunity in 1438 to 1439 to try and launch a pagan and Hellenistic revival amongst the Italian elite. Okay.
And his ideas continued on, even though after his death, sadly, most of his works were burned, which I'm so very tragic. But
well, the funny thing is, there's a copy of his laws, his ritual practice, in the library of Topkapi Palace here in Istanbul.
Wow.
Strangely enough, nobody's bothered to translate it. Of course, when the Ottomans took over, everything was here still. There was vast libraries, and they translated most of it into Ottoman Turkish, which is not modern Turkish. It was very rich Persian and Arabic and Turkic language. And they're all stored in the library here in Topkapi Palace. So it's not actually missing. It's just missing in amongst Western scholars.
I'm very, very glad to hear that. Well, I hope that one day that will be translated. But yes, so I think that it's really important that even though, well, then officially, for the purposes of the Italians of the late 15th century, those works would have been burned. However, his teachings and a lot of his influence was not lost by any means. It was definitely not lost.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit about
Can I just add something to that point, Joanna? When you say that it was not lost, in fact, it triggered what's now called the Second Renaissance. Okay, so the first Renaissance was largely based on Latin texts. And, it was associated with figures like Petrarch and so on. The Second Renaissance is the Hellenistic one. And it's all the figures like Botticelli and all the circle around Botticelli and in Florence and cities like that, in which a Hellenistic influence floods into the poetry and the art of the period. And you only need to look at Botticelli's Primavera, and it's brimming over with esoteric Platonism. Although a lot of art scholars are not interested in that anymore. There are other interpretive strategies they have. It's still there in the painting. And in so many other paintings. And I would argue it went on in European art for the next 200 years at least. Okay, so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's very, very important. And so with his attempt to revive essentially Hellenistic paganism and sort of spread those ideas through these elite Italian families, he was arguing for as you were saying, like a revitalization of Hellenic actual paganism, of practice paganism.
Yeah, absolutely.
However, this kind of then takes us to how that relates specifically to what's found in the deck, because while it's very influenced by obviously his ideas, we're not dealing a lot with Olympian gods, shall we say, or like the classical gods that we might immediately turn to and think about as in terms of Hellenic deities.
Yeah.
Specifically, we have, as we've already mentioned a couple of times, his name has come up, Saturn, Kronos, and in the Carthaginian form, Ammon, and that god being at the very center of what is found in these cards. Can you just talk a little bit about where his influence, where Ammon's influence fits in with this deck, and why he is so important as opposed to looking to more of the Olympian deities?
Yeah, I think what we talked about a little earlier, the atmosphere of this 15th century in terms of personal and state security, the incessant wars, the incessant breakout of plague every few years, marked the age so that it was an age of intense illumination in its art and poetry, and intense darkness in its fear and suspicion of its neighbors and the invading armies. And if you take that as a kind of lens or filter through which you pass this Hellenistic current, that current takes on a very dark form, because it's essentially a defensive theurgy that emerges at the other side, not the the illumination for illumination's sake, which had been the Hellenistic tradition. And certainly in the school of Athens, through which all of this stuff was channeled through for 1,000 odd years, you know, from the 3rd or 4th century into the 15th century, Kronos had stood for a state of non-duality as the deity above all the deities. But as you know, Kronos has a number of myths around them. One of them is that he ate his children and that he was overthrown by Zeus and cast into the underworld with the Titan gods. So if you say you've got one of these myths in each hand, in the 15th century Italy, the second lot of myths, the dark side, becomes the preponderant lens through which theurgy is viewed. Okay, so that's a very important kind of cultural shift. The Renaissance elite families were used to defensive sorcery, political use of sorcery. So that when something was placed in their hands that was ambivalent, it was a mechanism that you could use for enlightenment. They attempted to, or they interpreted it through a very dark lens indeed. And this brings us to the role of Ammon within the Dex imagery. And Ammon, I mean, from biblical times, was associated with the darkest acts, the child immolation. And that seemed to correspond in some way with this myth of Kronos consuming his own children. So it was natural that a, you know, kind of composite deity emerged as, you know, Kronos Ammon or Saturn Ammon. Now, we talked about the trump cards as having this kind of surface layer of history cast over them, which acts as a kind of trapdoor to let you drop through. Similarly, the court cards also have a dominating theme underlying them. And although the court cards are perfectly structured like a regular tarot deck, king, queen, knight, and page, they're all named, and the names are all figures from the Alexander Romance literature. Now, from something like the 4th century BC, when Alexander was still alive, a whole network of tales had grown up around him of his fantastic feats. And these became a staple of coffee house storytellers throughout the Middle East. You know, and this went on for centuries. Finally, these tales started to be transcribed, and there were a number of versions of it. And it was very popular in the 15th century up to the 17th century in Europe. The Alexander Romance literature, all these fantastic tales. So what the designer of the Sola-Busca has done is selected names from this vast array of stories, but there's a very peculiar angle to the selection. The names he selected are all related to Alexander the Great's conception, not to what he actually did or achieved in his lifetime. And I found this a very odd angle. So when I started digging into this, what was so unique about the conception itself? Of course, he wasn't conceived by his father. He was conceived by Ammon. On his journey out to India, Alexander identified as Ammon. He went to the oasis of Ammon, the great oracle in the Siwa oasis in the Sahara, and the priest there confirmed him in his belief that he was the son of Ammon. On his return from India, he identified with Dionysus, And again, there's a famous myth cycle around Dionysus going to India, conquering and coming back. So you'll find both of these themes. Now, the theme I haven't explored in the Sola-Busca is the Dionysian one. Okay. What I did explore is the identification with Ammon. And with Ammon and the Orphic version of Kronos, you get the dragon form. And the dragon form is a symbolic or esoteric language for the draconian current itself, which is both an external force and an inner force, a Kundalini force, so that the evocation of the deity triggers the Kundalini. And I believe that that is what is actually depicted in the ritual cards in the deck. A liturgical invocation of the deity, but in a very dark form, because all of the cosmological elements identified in the deck are malefic. And that's the thing that gave me the steer towards looking at the interpretive lens of the people who designed it. Anyway, I hope that's not too much of a monologue, but here we go.
The Alexander mythos, discussion and how that relates to things later. So now we've dived into that a little bit already. Before we kind of go deeper into, as you were saying, the theurgic sort of ritual cards that you kind of walk the reader through in your book, which is really incredible. And I want to talk about the ritual gestures and stuff like that that's related to that. There was another tie between some of the symbols that also relate to Ammon, or Zeus, Ammon, and other such sort of combinations. And that was there are very few female figures in the deck, which is very interesting. We haven't actually stated that yet, so I will just say that for people who haven't seen it. The queens in the deck are, I believe, are there only one or two others?
No, there's four.
Yeah,
one for each suit.
Yes, okay. And one of the figures that is very interesting, which relates to the oracle at Dodona, which is also linked with an oracle of Ammon at Libya, is the Five of Discs, I think it is. Which is the one.
Yes, I think you're right.
Yeah, that shows the woman who is, or the figure who is essentially, it's basically like a shamanically dressed figure, and it relates to how the oracle at Dodona was probably related to sound and things of that nature. I think probably it's because I'm a musician that I've always been fascinated.
Yeah.
Dodona.
Also, that oracle at Dodona was the twin of the oracle in the Siwa Oasis of Ammon.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That they are twinned.
And I just wanted to point out that there is that image of the discs as potentially something that the figure is hitting with something in order to create a sound, and there's also kind of a couple of places in the deck where that is shown, and that's yet another kind of hint at the connection between seeing like the Zeus Ammon figure as being central to this deck. Yeah,
absolutely.
So speaking about the ritual gestures and what's found in the cards, can you walk us through the theurgic ritual, just in brief, what you see as the progression happening through those cards? I know it's not the kind of thing that you can go in depth with because people are not looking at the cards.
Sure.
But there are certain ritual gestures that are very important that you point out, such as the identification of the way that figures are holding their hands up or covering their eyes and things like that. And I think that this element of ritual gesture and how it's encoded in images is something that I love what you've done, obviously in the Game of Saturn, but also very much in Mystai for those frescoes for Dionysus, and how that appreciation for ritual gesture in art is something that I feel like a lot of people are not as aware of, but it is really important to decoding and looking at what the inner meanings are of what we're looking at sometimes with these esoteric artworks.
I mean, I think you'd need to be an esotericist to spot ritual gesture as a major theme within the iconography. You know, if you're not coming from that angle, it's kind of invisible to you. You know, the significance of it would just pass you by. The interesting thing with the ritual is there's several stages here, and I can just summarize them without reference to the cards. But essentially what they seem to do is to create a menstruum, which is a mixture of menstrual blood and semen. As now, in the Renaissance worldview, this would constitute personhood. Okay, so that then seems to become the subject of immolation on a card. You see a figure dandling a tiny baby over flames. A rather sinister card, you may say. But what I believe there is that they're sacrificing this menstrual liquid as part of an invocation that's about to start. So the next significant figure, as you say, is holding their left hand over their right eye. Now, the left and right within Hellenistic ritual language are significant. The left and right are the positive and negatives. So when the left hand, for instance, covers the right eye, you are blocking the celestial sight of the celestial deities. And you're using the left hand to do it. And that means the left eye is open. So you're saying, in effect, I close my eyes to the celestial gods, I open my sight to the chthonic gods. And I think that this is a lead-in then to the invocation itself. Now, the decoding of the invocatory ritual card, I was helped by D.P. Walker's Spiritual and Demonic Magic, which is kind of classical text. In there, a student of Marsilio Ficino talks about the correct way to perform invocation. And he describes how you dress in colors and with a hat which conforms with the deity. And you use scents and stones and crystals, and everything is aligned. And then you allow your spirit, so to speak, to soar out of you. That description is almost perfectly what we see depicted in the card. And in addition to that, the figure is using a wand to spin a flaming globe mounted on top, on brackets, on a column. And this is almost certainly a depiction of Hecate's top from the Chaldean oracles. And it's totally a unique image in the history of Western magic to see a depiction of a Chaldean oracle ritual theurgic process being carried out. And it's clear from the colors that dominate that card. There's reds and purples, and from the draconian form of the hat the ritualist is wearing, and a number of other features like the ram that form the armrests of the throne he sat upon, that the ritual invocation is of the draconian energy in the form of Amun. So that, in a nutshell, is the ritual process spread across, I would say, 7 or 8 cards, giving the steps leading up to the creation of the substance to be sacrificed, the sacrifice itself, the opening of the ritual, the summoning and the invocation. And finally, we see a card in which a monk figure has these enormous bat wings coming out of the back of his body, and this golden diadem borne across his forehead. You know, and I read that as an iconography for a state of illumined awareness. But the illumination, those wings in Renaissance iconography are normally associated with the devil. But I don't believe that there's any Christian metaphysic at work within this deck's imagery whatsoever. These are the draconian wings, okay? So, and because the figure is dressed as a monk, it's trying to indicate to us that he's now moved out of the human realm He is possessed by that current and has become sanctified in his own right. And this is absolutely astounding image to see in Western art whatsoever.
It is an incredible image. It's an incredible card. I really was very moved when I was reading that section. And the idea of wings actually is all over the deck in so many different places. Winged sandals, people's feet with wings. But there's also the you point out there's the card that is Alexander himself kind of encoded when you're talking about the myth of Alexander, standing in front of a chariot that is drawn by mythical griffins, which I think you were also saying has a connection to that kind of soul flight, that theurgic, you know.
Absolutely. That's how they were read in the Renaissance. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
And the other pair of wings that I wanted to draw attention to is the raven that is on the Mato card. That card for me was just really fascinating. You have it on, is it actually the back? Yes, it is the back cover. I happen to have your book right here. I'm like, it is the back cover.
Yeah. You can hold it up, Joanna. Everyone will see it.
Well.
There it is. Yeah, it's an amazing image, isn't it?
Yeah, and there is that the raven that is on his shoulder, and you point out that it is, as you can clearly see, not daintily landing on his shoulder, but very much ripping or tearing at his skin, and how that relates to a very famous myth. Do you think you could tell us a little bit about that and how that might relate to that card? Because I think it's fascinating.
One way of reading that card is that it's the myth of the satyr who enjoined a competition with Apollo, who could play the pipes the best. And of course, Apollo is not going to lose that competition to this, nature creature, this talented nature creature. And he ripped him apart. So the raven is a theriomorphic form of Apollo. So again, this clever use of iconography, you can just stand in amazement at the depth of knowledge and the clever way they've conveyed it from myth and legend and, ritual and metaphysics. It's like an interleaving of the most intense magical tapestry you can imagine. I don't know of another artifact like it in the history of humanity.
No, I think that part of the fascination for me, and one of the reasons I want to talk just a little bit about the conception of fate and free will, because I mean, the podcast that here is about divination, and this is, as we've pointed out, not a deck that would have been used even in those times as like a gaming deck or anything like that, let alone a divinatory deck. But it does have all of this so much incredible, ritual and magic encoded in it. But I think that it's important before we go ahead, we've mentioned this word quite a bit, and I wanted to get your interpretation, because I think it'll tie into our discussion of fate later, of what the practice of theurgy is. Like, how would you define that word? Because you have a lovely discussion of it in the book and how it relates to what we will get into in terms of fate. But what is theurgy? Yeah. Is not quite clear.
Okay, around the 4th century, the mysteries of Eleusis, the sanctuary was destroyed. Okay, and I think the challenge for the priesthood was that they had been bestowed this initiatory lineage centuries before, and it was their responsibility to ensure that it survived the destruction of the sanctuary. And one way of doing so would be to take the core of the ritual process of initiation and transpose it to a more domestic environment. And this is precisely what the mysteries of Dionysus had undergone in the Villa of the Mysteries in Pompeii. They had transposed the mythically imbued landscape of Dionysus into one room, so that the frescoes contained the landscape, elements of myth, the ritual practices for the initiation, and the process. as well as a rendition of the sacred couple, Dionysus and Ariadne. And having done that, so to speak, they had a theatre of memory by which to retain a connection to that initiatory practice. I believe something similar happened with Eleusis. The last hierophant of Eleusis, Nestorius, his son, Plutarch of Athens, opened a school of advanced Hellenistic studies immediately after the destruction of the sanctuary. And with that, they trained his daughter, and probably nobody has heard about her ever before, Asclepigenea, was trained in the initiatory tradition of the rites of Eleusis and the entire rites of theurgy. And from that period onwards, throughout the 5th century, she was the initiatrix. She was the high priestess of the rites of Eleusis. And I've not seen anyone talking about this before. But it's an astounding fact. In parallel with this, her father, Plutarch of Athens, opened this school of Hellenistic studies, which, given the fact that they could give initiation, training in theurgy, as well as the metaphysics, meant that it was a magnet for the best intellects of the entire Hellenistic world who flooded to it, people like Proclus. He ran that school for 50 years alongside Asclepigenea. In other words, the initiatory tradition of Eleusis was kept alive for a century at least after the destruction of the sanctuary. And I believe it probably continued on for another 50 years after that. Michael Pacellus in the 10th and 11th centuries claimed that the rites of Eleusis were still being practiced in Athens as late as the 8th century, which is an astounding fact. Most of us are taught that with the destruction of the sanctuary, it died out in the 4th century. But here, 400 years later, it was still being practiced. So theurgy became the way of invoking a deity once you had had the initiation. The initiation forges, as it does today, forges a link between the initiate and the deity, which lasts forever. Okay, it's an ongoing commitment from life to life once that initiation has been effected. By having the initiation, it frees you to then invoke the deity independently of a priesthood. And that's the essence of theurgy. If you try and do theurgy without the initiation, it's like trying to pick yourself up with your bootlaces. It's really hard work. If it can even be done. I mean, you need enormous dedication. You need to become almost a mystic to accomplish invocation of the deity fully into yourself. So we have initiatory lineage, we have theurgy underneath it. And this for me explains why theurgy reoccurs with Michael Pacellus and then with Platon. Now, to what extent they were able to tap into this current, to what extent they had access to a valid initiatory lineage, I cannot answer. We don't know. But on the evidence of what's depicted in that card, it looks like some successful ritual performance is being enacted half a century after the end of Platon's time.
I believe now, I didn't have this in my notes, but I believe there was something in the iconography of the deity when, I think it's in that card with the monk-like figure with the wings, that the image of the deity that has been called forth is similar to some texts describing who they would have been invoking, that they wouldn't have, that the artist would not have had access to. Which
it's one of the Orphic fragments, Joanna, which is incredible. You know, the wings are up on the head. It's exactly explained like that in the Orphic fragments. You know, which so of course that dates the image iconographically to, you know, before Plato. You're back in the 7th, 8th century with that type of iconography. So its recurrence in the 15th century is astounding. It certainly doesn't occur in the Chaldean oracles, which would be a text that they had access to. That, you know, I looked for it, I couldn't find it. The Chaldean oracles describes a different image or vision as a result of theurgy. So, you know, the wings on the shoulder were quite a surprise to me. And it, you know, it kind of was the imprimatur of saying, yes, this is the real business.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some very profound process here beyond magic is going on.
So in essence, then, one of the things that you talk a little bit about in the book is the idea of fate and the fate of souls, and how someone like Plato and the Stoics that he's kind of related to in terms of philosophical outlook looked at the journey of a soul, and how that is different from the Christian conception of it. And I'm very fascinated with people's views of fate versus free will. So I kind of want to talk about what view of fatedness you think is kind of encoded in the worldview and the magical view of this deck. And then I'd also love to like flip it over to you and say, what is your view of that question? But first, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, this was the central spiritual issue in Hellenistic metaphysics. So essentially you take incarnation accidentally, you fall into it as a result of what we today would call karma. But, you know, they recognize that imperfection in the mode of life. They had a model called the ladder of virtues, by which one cleansed and purified one's inner self in relationship to the world. And at the highest level, this would be a non-attachment. But you don't just jump to non-attachment. You have to work your way through. And that includes a set of virtues for communal life, your family life, a set of virtues for the civic life. I mean, you can't skip these things. You have to be correct at those levels as well as the higher levels, because the higher levels are resting on them. So that, you know, as you move towards theurgy, you're talking about a kind of dispassionate connection, non-attachment, and finally non-duality. Okay, and it's with this non-duality, and this comes about through the merger of your awareness with the deity, that you get the cleansing of the karmic traces that force reincarnation, successive reincarnations. That process is called hymarmene. It's fate, destiny, pulls you back into material reality, into fresh incarnation. But through the practice of the ladder of virtues, on the ascension of that, the attainment of union with a deity, and it could be any of the 12 deities, you free yourself of the force of hymarmene or fate. And that means you've achieved a level of liberation. It doesn't stop there, though. Liberation is not the outcome that's sought ultimately. It's quite clear in Plato, and it'll be in my forthcoming book. We're running ahead of ourselves a bit. Plato is quite clear that people who achieve that ultimate level of illumination are absolutely required to then reincarnate. And the reason is they're now in a position to be of service on a much, much wider scale, because essentially we're all connected at a most fundamental level, and we're not illumined and liberated until every one is illumined and liberated. Okay.
So very similar to the idea that people might be familiar of with the bodhisattvas, or
yes, it's amazing, isn't it? You know, the two at this level, the two systems line up with each other perfectly. Theurgy to the Vajrayana, the levels of illumination based on virtue, and the final reincarnation as the ultimate spiritual duty, totally in alignment. And it's not perhaps surprising if we look at the root of this tradition in the Hellenic world with the Ammonius Sacer. Now, he's a very strange character. Very little is known about him. But the surname or the qualifier Sacer is strange because it sounds exactly like the Central Asian tribe, Sacer, from which the Buddha also came. He's the Sakyamuni Buddha, okay? And we know, for instance, that the gymnosophists were in Alexandria. We have classical texts about that. Who were the gymnosophists, the yogis? So this is covered fairly extensively in a book by, I think, McInerney, The Shape of Ancient Thought. And he talks about the correspondences between Hellenistic metaphysics and Buddhist metaphysics and how they may have come about through the Silk Road as a common connecting channel. Okay, so Hymarmene and fate are the norm as long as our spiritual body is not purified. And upon being purified, we are then liberated of fate. That's the illumined state. So I don't have anything to add to that. I completely subscribe to this system. I'm not just an academic. This is how things are for me.
And so in that sense, how would you see, because we've kind of touched on how the worldview of the people who were, I don't know what he's using, it's the wrong word, but the people who created it and who would have then had access to it, their worldview was a one that had many problems and challenges. And as you said, they were used to using magic for practical means in order to work with their world. Is there any difference, would you say, in how they viewed that process of fate in terms of what they wanted to do with it? Or is it very, very much in line with that classical Platonic idea? Or was it?
That's very difficult to answer. And it's easy for us to judge. When we, they had a responsibility for a city-state and everyone in it. And that included their own extended family and everyone who depended on them. That is part of the ladder of virtues, to take care of your family, to be civically responsible, and yet still pursue a spiritual path on top of that. And it's very difficult for us today to cast our imaginations into being a Renaissance or a part of a Renaissance princely family, subject to these pressures and knowing how that would influence you. So it's very difficult to answer. The metaphysics has this illumined path in it, but the realities on the ground had a lot of dangers attached to them. And I suspect most of us today would be happy to use magical means to defend our own families. Absolutely. I don't think we probably think twice about it, actually. And when you kind of position that action within the ladder of virtues, instead of seeing it as falling away from the spiritual life, you see that interpretation is faulty to an extent. It's not a loss of spirituality. It's recognizing that spirituality manifests on a lot of different levels, and we have responsibilities on each of those levels. Okay, and then it's down to each person's judgment, isn't it, at the end of the day?
And I do think that comes across in the book, because I think that it is, like you said, a faulty interpretation of it, but it is something that I think from the outside, that kind of like Gnostic, theurgic ascent model can seem to be something that you have to have some pure life that is basically impossible, or be disconnected from the realities of life in order to be able to practice. But this, as you're saying, this was something that was very much in the practices of the time and very much meant to be lived in a way that is not just a philosophical concept that you sort of tuck away.
Yeah, I mean, in the Hellenistic tradition that I know, the asceticism, which you find with Christianity, was not really a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
You lived all of the ladder of virtues, all the levels simultaneously. That was the goal. And you see this in the life of Proclus, for instance. If you read Marinus's Life of Proclus, you can easily find it online. That text, short text of his life, is structured on the basis of the ladder of virtues. And it shows how on each level Proclus lived out the meaning of the virtues at all levels. Mm-hmm. You know, so it's a good model to have with you. Gives you more options, I think, instead of the kind of judgmental thing that comes from too much spiritual metaphysics getting kind of dumped on top of you. You know, it's very easy to feel like mobbed. You know, how can I ever live up to that? Well, you can't. You're not meant to, and don't bother. You know, it's a much more fruitful and generative model, in my mind, at least.
So there's something, just going back to the cards themselves.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there are quite a number of the cards that you have not, or at least at the time of publication of this book a couple of years ago, you had not sufficiently kind of figured out what they were trying to say to the reader, or the person who was in possession of the cards. Is there anything that is not related to any books forthcoming that you might be able to fill in about those other cards, or something that you want to say to why you think some of those sort of don't respond to, you know, looking at them closely nowadays? Is it just something that we don't have the references because maybe the texts, the literary texts that they were referencing?
That's exactly it. That's exactly it, Joanna. Yeah. You know, so every now and again I stumble across a piece of classical learning, and all of a sudden it illumines one of the cards. Like Lentulus, I didn't know who it was until I stumbled across this story of him, you know, attempted coup d'etat, and I got the reference for that. You know, Plutarch's Parallel Lives, it's in there, you know. Another one I saw the other day, I think, was it the Three of Swords? It's a very strange figure, an elderly man and a young man, and they're like semi-naked, and, you know, it's a bit, there is a kind of homoerotic theme running throughout this deck. And it suddenly struck me that this is Alcibiades and Socrates. Alcibiades was the young student of Socrates, and they had this, and there was like Alcibiades boasted that he had seduced Socrates. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I mean, this isn't in the book. It's occurred to me just weeks ago, actually. You know, again, you'd stumble across a reference, and you think of the card, there it is. And there's one in which one of the priestess cards appears to have like a vine descending down to her neck. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you recall that card, and I mentioned this theme of strangulation. Apparently, there's a ritual, an ancient Hellenistic ritual in which I forget the name of the festival, but the girls would swing on like ropes. Mm-hmm. Okay, and this has a ritual import and may have been a humanization of an actual hanging, a ritual hanging of a young woman that was part of the ritual process, you know, probably hundreds and hundreds of years before. So again, that card may be depicting that festival. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so they're the two that immediately spring to mind, you know, because the kind of the references just come out of nowhere in the last couple of weeks. So evidently this requires somebody far more au fait with Hellenistic literature than I am. That includes things like Plutarch, Livy, but also Platonic dialogues, the magical literature like Chaldean oracles, Proclus, The various astrological texts that would have been current in the 15th century, even though they would have been written, who knows, in Hellenistic era, there's probably a pool of a you know, half a dozen to a dozen texts that are fairly critical, that if you had a good command of them.
Oh no, it froze. I don't know.
Was exceptional. I mean, you know, it was wow. It was like a European library if it had 500 books that, you know, people would travel across the continent to see that. Today, of course, you know, that number of books, that amount of information on the internet, we cannot be as au fait with the text that they were. So, you know, like the educational system, you would learn 50, 60 lines of Virgil's Aeneid as your day-to-day, you know, homework. You know, kids who could do 30 lines of the Aeneid overnight and recite it the next day were pretty good, you know. So that kind of learning has dislocated our relationship to text. And most of the people, I suspect, who have the academic knowledge of these texts are probably not interested in Sola-Busca and its magical worldview. You know, there's probably a disconnect there as well.
Well, I think that we're all extremely glad that you were this, or else we wouldn't have this.
Well, I didn't do anything else for 3 years.
So I want to just to ask you if you could talk, as there's just so much in this deck.
Yeah, sure. We have to come back and do another session sometime.
I want to talk about, you know, the books that you have coming out. But before that, why do you think it is important to study a deck like this? I suppose it's the kind of question where I'm asking, what do you feel like it has given you, or what do you feel that it gives to the reader, and why do you feel it's so important? I think it's fascinating and amazing, and I could give my reasons, but I'm much more interested in yours.
Yeah, well, first thing is it introduced me to a whole series of channels of education that I hadn't encountered before. That was great. You know, I didn't know the Alexandria Romance literature and its history. You know, I didn't know it even existed. So, but it was fascinating for me because of where I live. On top of that, it forced me to seriously consider the kind of Gnostic worldview that many of us end up with as a result of enculturation in the West. This kind of background of Christianity as a filter, even though we're not practicing Christians or anything like that, we still tend to think really firmly in Gnostic terms of good and bad. And you see an enormous amount of that on the internet. So one of the excitements around the Game of Saturn when it first came out was the fact that it was viewed through a Gnostic lens of good and evil. But the Hellenistic worldview is far more holistic. That Gnostic lens is a distinctly Christian one, I've learned. You know, in terms of Plato and Proclus, you know, no matter is evil. You know, there simply isn't that conception. So the reading of Cronus, for instance, as a kind of demonic force, again, is totally alien to the Hellenistic worldview. You know, he's the rightful owner of the underworld with the Titans. You know, if you need to do stuff in relationship to material reality, they're the go-to guys for that. If you need to do stuff on the celestial plane, the Olympian gods are the go-to guys for that. You know, this is not a moral judgment. So I think for me, it was liberating in the sense that, you know, I became aware of this Gnostic lens in our interpretation of spiritual phenomena, which I hadn't been acutely aware of before. It forced me to confront that and then to think about it. And I think the deck is extremely valuable in that sense. It challenges you on many fronts. And, you know, that challenge is always productive and generative. Very important in that sense. Of course, the other layer of it is that it's a complete introduction to Hellenistic liturgy, which, you know, there's nothing like that. That's astounding in its own right.
It absolutely is. And I'm so glad that you point out that kind of like drawing awareness, at least, to the lens that we tend to have as background noise on top of how we view these things. And that, you're right, that is an absolutely fascinating way that it challenges you when you're reading it and looking at it. So can you now speak to us a little bit about the projects that you have coming up? And specifically, I think you mentioned that one of them might have to do with this book a little bit. So I would love for you to at least tell us a little bit you can.
I can't say much. It's not announced, but it is essentially tracing the tradition from Renaissance Italy back to its source. And we talked a little bit about that earlier when I mentioned the rites of Eleusis. So I've gone back to that and researched it and kind of put together what happened and how the ritual lineage, the initiatory lineage, was preserved and carried forward into the early modern period almost. That's the essence of the book. It's been manifested in the sacred architecture of a particular building, one of the world's iconic buildings. And for the first time, I will give the sacred architecture. I will show how it is a direct lineal descent of the rites of Eleusis and that tradition.
I cannot tell you how much I will be looking forward to that. So I'm sure so many of my listeners will be agreeing with me on that. Are there any other projects that you want to tell us about, or things that you
for many years, like 20 odd years, my wife and I have been energy healers, you know, and we have put together the most challenging cases of energy healing, the ones that have the biggest implications for our understanding of consciousness and reality. And although I kind of self-published this work many years ago, it's now going to come out in a proper format within the traditions this winter. It's in their catalogue. The book will be available in January. It's the book is The Power of the Healing Field. And for anyone who's interested in the potentialities and possibilities of healing, this book is going to be an eye-opener.
No, it sounds fantastic, and I'm anything that I can link to in terms of, you know, what's already out there that people can pre-order or purchase your other books. I will.
The catalogue of inner traditions is out there.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Then I'll have that linked in the show notes.
Yeah, you'll find me buried in that catalogue somewhere. The other work, of course, we haven't really touched upon is Mystai. And you had said you'd like to talk about the initiator. It has come up now and again.
Yes,
I don't know if you want to spend any time on that at this point,
or
we'll do a separate program on Mystai if you want.
Well, we would need an entire other conversation for that. I think that if I can just ask you to perhaps kind of as a teaser for people, if you would come back on the show and talk to me about Mystai on another occasion, it'd be lovely. But one of the things, and I think it is, we've touched on it a little bit in this conversation already as it relates to theology and the Game of Saturn, but you've talked about initiation and the importance of initiation. And that is very much theme, obviously, of Mystai and the frescoes there. Can you talk a little bit about the process of initiation and what is so important about it and how that relates to some of these mystery traditions? This Game of Saturn may not actually be in itself what would be considered a mystery tradition, or perhaps you would think that it is. But if you could just kind of give us a little bit of your interpretation of that, and are they similar? Are they is there some similarity between the initiation kind of and the theurgy of Game of Saturn and the rites of Dionysus and what you see in decoded in that.
Yeah. The parallel here is with modern Vajrayana. Okay, Vajrayana is practiced today, and the rites and rituals are quite clear. The phenomenology of participation is clear, and that casts a huge light on the ancient traditions of initiation. And initiation in the Hellenistic world was always the initiation of a specific deity, just like Vajrayana. And it is the forging of a relationship with that deity such that you become possessed by the deity. In other words, your awareness merges with the deity. Now, the important thing here is that to enact this ritual, there needs to be a degree of inner purity achieved. So in the Hellenistic world, there was always two stages to the initiation. The first one, myesis, was a cleansing ritual. And the cleansing was a ritual itself. It was conducted by the priesthood and essentially cleansed you of all impurity, including that within your ancestral line. Okay, this was important because if your vibratory level when you're subjected to real healing initiation changes, it goes up a frequency. Okay, so people I've seen who've had ritual initiation, healing initiations of various types, they're always glowing afterwards. Okay, so we're looking for that kind of actual shift on an esoteric level. And having done that, you then need to undertake a whole series of oaths because you're about to commit your, let's call it soul for want of a better word. That's a useful bookmark for me. You're about to commit that in perpetuity to that deity. Okay, this is a commitment of service. So the deity you choose should be the one that naturally vibrates with your own energy. Okay, then you need to find someone who's capable of conducting an initiation and somebody who has a lineage. Now, one of the healing practices I've been doing these last 20 odd years is Reiki, for instance, Usui Reiki. So I know my lineage. I know exactly everyone in my lineage where I got the initiation from. And when I initiate people, I know they're getting a very pure form of that. Okay, I've been initiating people for 20 odd years, and that's helped to provide a certain insight into the ethnography of esoteric practice, let's call it that. I doubt if that ethnography actually exists at this point in time, but who knows, maybe one day. So for the Hellenistic world, the lineages were incredibly precious things, but how they came about is lost in mythic time. So, for instance, the town of Magnesia on the Meander wanted to institute the mysteries of Dionysus, so they sent to the oracle at Delphi, and Delphi said, okay, go to this place where the descendants of the nymphs who looked after Dionysus on the hillside live. And those women are holding that initiatory lineage. And 3 of them went to the town, set up an initiatory lineage there. So what I'm saying is there was a mechanism within the Hellenistic world for identifying and transmitting initiations, which is largely lost in the modern world, which doesn't mean that it cannot happen. I'm not saying that, because an esoteric initiation is not interrupted by the death of someone. Okay, it can recur spontaneously, especially in certain families, in certain genetic descent. So this thing has a kind of iceberg, 90% hidden character. You know, we talked about the tangential nature of the non-personal linear histories, they work with a different logic, non-linear logic. They're atemporal. Okay, so in my own case, I was very fortunate to have received initiation into a genuine tarot tradition, which was, the way this works is that you get initiated, and as a result, you have a certain vision, and the initiator checks that that vision is in accordance with the tradition. The vision is never told to anyone, but it may come as a surprise or not to your audience, I don't know, but there's also a initiatory lineage and tradition of tarot. Okay. And I'm sure there's many other lineages and initiatory traditions. So the question really is about the power of them. So the initiations of deity are amongst the most powerful you can receive. And, you know, in other cultures, of course, like India and Tibet, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people go to these initiations, and they all get initiated. And I'm talking, of course, about things like Kalachakra. They have the same vision of deity as a result of that. And certainly once I was in a teaching by Dalai Lama. I went to Copenhagen and he was teaching there. At the end of it, he says, well, I'm going to give a blessing, you know. So we all sat there. And it was like a flame went round my head. And, you know, I understood then it was a genuine transmission occurring.
And wow,
so,
yeah.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, please, I interrupted.
Not at all. I was just coming to the end then.
Yeah, it's very.
Did I answer your question, Joanna? I'm not sure.
It was a very open-ended question, so it was.
Yeah, it was a little.
I think that in the end, it does beg the question then that since these initiatory, this is not necessarily related, you know, specifically to your work on Mystai, but this is more kind of what you were, the points that you were making just there. Since the West has lost so many of its initiatory traditions, and that arguably has had enormously, you know, deleterious effects for our society, which I, you know, think would be good to fix. But since, as you mentioned, it is very difficult to pull up by the bootstraps in order to do this. And there are traditions, you know, that have initiatory traditions. And as you said, even something as incredible as the mysteries of Eleusis or Dionysus are lost in the mists of time, how they were transmitted from the divine to humans. And ultimately, the divine is the true initiator. You need to have people and traditions for them to work through, but it is the divine itself that is the initiator. Is there anything that you see as a positive sign in our society, or things that you think show that maybe initiation or this idea of that transmission is coming back, or no?
It's very difficult to say because we're in such a polarized situation that I see enormous growth of awareness, environmental awareness, respect for sentience in more and more species, all of these positive things, but I also see enormous distraction. You know, like it's like the pollution pouring through the internet, deluge of useless information, meaningless games, pornography. So it's like a centrifugal force pulling society in two different directions, opposite directions. That's what I perceive. So I think if a person is inspired to change their relationship to reality in a radical way, there's never been a better opportunity to do so. There's so many resources available now. It's incredible. But on the other hand, you need to be very discriminatory in what you pick up. You know, my personal advice to everyone is to do healing first, self-healing, and heal others. Get into the service mindset as soon as you can, you know, because nothing is going to progress your spiritual growth faster than serving others. You know, we've got these incredible healing mechanisms, rebirthing breath work, emotional freedom techniques. I mean, you can pick these things up, you can start applying them. And in doing so, you start that process of purification of your energy body, which is the essential prerequisite for moving along the spiritual path, you know. That and service, you know, it's as simple as that. And then on that path, you're going to encounter the help and the energies necessary. You know, for me, Reiki has been incredible. You know, it's absolutely a spiritual force. I respect it. It's a set of beings or entities, pure healing entities. So, you know, it's just one aspect of what I would say is my spiritual vocabulary.
Yeah, okay. And as you point out, that is that first stage.
Try and paint with a palette of lots of colors.
No, but it's the essential first stage is that purification, like you were saying. That's for all the ancient mystery traditions.
Yeah,
and do that yourself, you know, even though you don't have the exact, you know, requirements of the mystery traditions necessarily. Although I'm very excited for when you put that book out and what you reveal there. But essentially, it is still your own work to do that preparation. Yeah. And there have been actually several other guests that have pointed out, I think it is something so important for people to do that cleansing work, because it is stage one. If you're not doing that work for purification and work on yourself, then
it's not going to go anywhere, or it's not going to go in a healthy way. You know, people need to watch out for gurus. You know, you don't need a guru, and if they find themselves playing in a certain negative train of thought again and again in their mind, they have to start disciplining it and turning it off. And you keep turning those negative thoughts off until they stop playing. You know, this is like the first step in liberating yourself. And then learn one of these healers, get Reiki, get EFT, learn it, apply it to yourself, and start applying it to other people. You do this, you're on the way. It's just one step after the other, Joanna. You know, that's I'd advise anyone, take those steps. You'll be on the way.
You already answered what is always my last question for people, which is what advice would you give people to focus on in their lives right now? What is one thing that you'd like to leave them with? Is there anything you want to add to that? Because I feel like you already kind of have, but
I could say it again if it helps.
Say it again. Louder, just to make sure people heard you.
Okay, if you've got negative tapes playing in your mind, whatever they are, switch them off. Every time you hear them starting to play again, switch them off, and you keep switching them off until they stop playing. Okay, number one. Number two, get hold of a couple of healing modalities like EFT, Gary Craig's classic EFT, rebirthing breathwork if it's your thing, Reiki definitely, because that's spiritual healing. And start applying them first to yourself and then start helping other people. And if you do these basic steps, it's going to take you further on the spiritual path than any amount of reading whatsoever.
Must be actually applied in order to.
You got to do it. That is the spiritual path. So again, the ladder of virtues, you know, at the top end, it has illumination, but at the bottom end, it's doing this basic stuff. It's getting to the point where you become a service or serving within your civic community, a positive force. That's the gateway then into the higher levels. So start with yourself, get to the community, move on to the higher levels. You know, that's the ladder, climb it. That's what I've learned, I think, more than anything else from this sojourn in the Hellenistic world.
Well, I definitely will hopefully have you back on to talk about Mystai in more depth for people, because I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for that. And when your other book projects are out, yes, that will
hopefully
be
later this year.
I cannot wait to read that and all of your other works. If people don't already know Mystai, they need to read it anyway. So yes, I will have everything linked in the show notes and ways to find you. Are you on any kind of social media, or is it more just?
Oh yeah, I'm all over social media.
Okay, yeah,
I've got a website, Twitter, Facebook. I don't spend a lot of time on it, but I'm there.
I think I'm kind of the same. I'm on them, but
Yeah,
you can find
there's
me,
only so many hours in the day, Joanna,
and especially for how much research and work you're doing. I can't imagine.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for making time for this interview. I deeply appreciate it. And yes, thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, that was absolutely as amazing as I expected, and I'm very grateful to Peter for taking the time to make this interview happen. I highly recommend reading The Game of Saturn, if you haven't already, and checking out all his other works, which are fantastic. I've linked to his publications in the show notes, and will certainly share any updates I hear on the new works he'll be putting out with everyone on the Coffee and Divination mailing list. If you're not on that list already, I recommend clicking over to our website to add your email, as I send out early episode links and some special additions to everyone via email. As always, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts if you enjoy what we're doing here, and please check out our website at coffeeanddivination.com. Enjoy your journeys with divination, and I'll see you next time.